What if I told you that the Ethiopian Bible isn't the oldest Bible? And what if I told you that its translations are nearly identical?
While the world looks to Rome for answers, the oldest secrets of the faith have been sitting in a remote monastery in the Ethiopian highlands for nearly 2,000 years. We're talking about a Bible that contains 81 books, 15 more than the one on your nightstand.
To the second coming of Jesus Christ. Do you know what exactly will happen when Jesus comes the second time? Now, the Bible is very clear. Jesus Christ will come a second time.
These forbidden pages claim to reveal exactly what Jesus did after the resurrection, and why Hollywood's most controversial director, Mel Gibson, is reportedly obsessed with these hidden, ancient truths. What if the stories we know were edited for a reason? The 800-year gap. While the Western world was busy navigating the collapse of the Roman Empire and the subsequent tightening of the official biblical canon, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was doing something radical. They were preserving everything. While the Council of Nicaea and later Western councils were trimming the fat, deciding which books were divinely inspired and which were dangerous, the monks in the Horn of Africa kept the scrolls rolling. The result? The Ethiopian Bible isn't just a different translation. It's an entirely different library. It contains 81 books, compared to the 66 found in the standard Protestant Bible. This isn't just a minor discrepancy of a few footnotes or a mistranslated verse. We are talking about nearly 20 additional texts that offer a radically different perspective on the cosmos, the war between good and evil, and most importantly, the nature of Jesus Christ himself. For centuries, Western scholars looked at these Ethiopian texts as mere curiosities, local folklore, or apocryphal fluff. But then, carbon dating started to catch up with the legends. In the remote Garima monastery, tucked away in the Tigray highlands, sits the Garima Gospels. For a long time, experts thought these beautifully illustrated manuscripts dated back to the 11th century. However, recent testing has dropped a bombshell. They actually date between 330 and 650 AD. This makes them some of the oldest, if not the oldest, illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence. They didn't just appear out of nowhere, they are a direct line to the early, unedited pulse of the faith. Why does this matter? Because it means the Ethiopian Church was operating on a timeline that bypassed the Great Edit of the West. When the Roman Catholic Church was consolidating power, they had to create a unified narrative. To do that, certain books had to go. The Book of Enoch, which describes fallen angels and giant Nephilim, was tossed out. The Book of Jubilees, which gives a day-by-day account of creation and the secret lives of the patriarchs, was scrubbed. But in Ethiopia, these books remained central. This creates an 800-year gap in the Western consciousness. For nearly a millennium, the West moved forward with a curated, streamlined version of the Gospel, while the Ethiopian tradition held on to a much weirder, much more expansive vision of reality. It's like the difference between watching the 90-minute theatrical cut of a movie and the 4-hour director's cut that explains every plot hole and introduces 3 new subplots. This is exactly where someone like Mel Gibson enters the picture. Gibson has always been a filmmaker obsessed with the visceral truth over the sanitized version. From the brutal realism of the Passion of the Christ to the historical grit of Apocalypto, he gravitates toward the stories that have been smoothed over by time. The Ethiopian Bible represents the ultimate uncut version. It offers a version of the Christian story that hasn't been put through the filter of European political interests. In the West, we are taught that the Bible is a closed loop, a finished product. The Ethiopian tradition suggests it's more like a living archive. The inclusion of the Kebra Nagast, the glory of the kings, for example, ties the lineage of the Ethiopian monarchy directly to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, claiming that the Ark of the Covenant itself was moved to Ethiopia for safekeeping. This isn't just extra reading. This is a fundamental shift in where the center of the spiritual world actually lies. If the Ark is in Ethiopia, and the oldest Gospels are in Ethiopia, then maybe the most important details about what happened after the resurrection are also hidden in Ethiopia. While Western Bibles often end the story of the resurrection with a few appearances and an ascension into the clouds, the Ethiopian canon hints at a much more involved, much more mystical post-resurrection ministry. It suggests that the Great Commission wasn't just a quick pep talk before leaving. It was a deep dive into the secrets of the kingdom that the disciples weren't ready for before the crucifixion. By holding on to these books for 800 years while the rest of the world forgot them, the Ethiopian church acted as a spiritual black box recorder. Now that we are finally cracking it open, the data inside is challenging everything we thought we knew about the foundation of the faith. We are finding a version of Jesus that is less about the meek and mild imagery of the Middle Ages and more about a cosmic revolutionary who was teaching his followers how to navigate the very fabric of reality. The gap is closing, but as the two versions of the story collide, it's sparking a firestorm of questions. If these books are legitimate, why were they hidden? If they contain the words of Jesus, why aren't they in the hands of every believer? And most importantly, if the Ethiopian Bible is right, then what exactly did the world miss during those 40 days between the empty tomb and the clouds? What if the most shocking part of the story isn't where Jesus went, but what he brought back with him? After the resurrection, the lost 40 days, and the secret teachings. In the standard Western Bible, the story of the resurrection feels like a triumphant, yet surprisingly brief, victory lap. Jesus rises, appears to a few people on a dusty road, shows Thomas his wounds, gives a quick, "Go and preach to all nations" speech, and then whoosh, he's gone, ascending into the clouds. It's a clean ending, but if you open the Ethiopian canon, particularly texts like the Epistula Apostolorum, the Epistle of the Apostles, that 40-day window between the empty tomb and the ascension starts to look a lot more like a masterclass in cosmic reality. The Ethiopian tradition suggests that during these 40 days, Jesus wasn't just hanging out or proving he was alive. He was delivering the advanced placement version of his teachings. Think about it. Before the crucifixion, the disciples were constantly confused. They argued about who was the greatest. They fell asleep during prayers, and they completely missed the point of most parables. But after the resurrection, they suddenly became fearless, enlightened architects of a global movement. The Ethiopian Bible fills in the how and the why of that transformation. In these lost discourses, the post-resurrection Jesus is depicted as a figure of immense power and esoteric knowledge. He doesn't just talk about being kind to neighbors, he talks about the structure of the heavens, the hierarchy of angels, and the fate of souls. There is a sense that the resurrection unlocked a new level of communication. According to these ancient Ethiopian manuscripts, Jesus revealed secrets about the interstitial spaces, the realms between life and death, and gave his followers a roadmap for what was to come. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a bridge between dimensions. One of the most riveting aspects of these texts is the detail regarding the harrowing of hell. While the Apostles' Creed mentions that he descended into hell, the Ethiopian texts paint a cinematic picture of this event. They describe a literal breaking of the gates, a confrontation with ancient shadows, and the liberation of souls dating back to Adam. It portrays the resurrection not just as a personal comeback, but as a cosmic prison break. This isn't the meek and mild Jesus. This is a warrior king reclaiming the keys to the universe. For someone like Mel Gibson, who famously explored the physical agony of the crucifixion, this extended edition of the resurrection is pure narrative gold. There's a persistent rumor in film circles that Gibson's long-awaited sequel, The Passion of the Christ, Resurrection, isn't going to be a straightforward Sunday school story. Instead, it's rumored to delve into these very realms, the supernatural, the infernal, and the divine behind-the-scenes action that the Ethiopian Bible documents so vividly. Gibson has hinted in interviews that the film will be a real trip involving other realms and fallen angels. He's looking for the grit beneath the glory, and the Ethiopian canon provides the perfect script. But why were these details left out of the Western version? Some theologians argue that the early church fathers in Rome felt these secret teachings were too close to Gnosticism, the idea that salvation comes through secret knowledge rather than simple faith. They wanted a gospel that was accessible to the masses, a level 1 entry point that wouldn't confuse a peasant in Gaul or a merchant in Corinth. The Ethiopian church, however, never felt the need to dumb it down. They believed that if Jesus said it, it belonged in the book, no matter how out there or complex it seemed. This leads to a fascinating realization. What we call the Bible in the West might actually be the edited for television version. The Ethiopian Resurrection extension suggests that the most profound instructions for humanity weren't given on a mountainside in Galilee to a crowd of 5,000, but in hushed, private conversations with the 11 remaining apostles after the world thought the story was over. These texts claim Jesus spoke of the end of days, with a precision that makes the book of Revelation look like a teaser trailer. He spoke of the restoration of all things and the specific mechanics of how the physical world would eventually merge back with the spiritual one. Imagine being a disciple in those 40 days. You've seen your leader executed, and now he's standing in front of you, radiating a light that shouldn't exist, explaining the blueprints of the afterlife. The Ethiopian Bible captures that electricity. It treats the resurrection not as the end of the story, but as the beginning of the real work. It suggests that the Great Commission wasn't just about starting a religion. It was about preserving a specific frequency of truth that could survive for 2,000 years, even if it had to hide in the mountains of Africa to do it.
1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead.
This is the forbidden part of the story. If the public knew that Jesus spent his final days on earth talking about multidimensional travel, the fall of the Watchers, and the specific architecture of the spirit world, the simple faith of the Middle Ages might have looked very different. It would have been a faith of explorers and mystics, not just followers. And perhaps that was exactly what the institutionalized church was afraid of. The Ethiopian monks have guarded these 81 books with their lives, surviving invasions, colonial pressures, and the harsh isolation of the highlands. They didn't do it out of a love for extra trivia. They did it because they believed these 40 days of teachings were the literal keys to the kingdom. And as modern science and cinema start to catch up to these ancient concepts of time, space, and spirit, it seems the rest of the world is finally ready to listen. This isn't just about theology, it's about a cinematic obsession. The Gibson Factor. When Mel Gibson released The Passion of the Christ in 2004, it wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural earthquake. Critics called it gratuitous. Believers called it the most honest depiction of sacrifice ever put to film. But for Gibson, that film was only the beginning, the prologue to a much larger, darker, and more supernatural story. For years, rumors have swirled around his sequel, simply titled Resurrection. But here is the kicker. Gibson isn't looking at the sanitized Sunday school version of The Rising. He's reportedly digging into the gritty, extra-canonical, and ancient sources found in the Ethiopian Bible to map out what happens next. Why is a Hollywood A-lister obsessed with 2,000-year-old Ethiopian manuscripts? Because Gibson has always been a cinematic disruptor. He doesn't want the greatest hits version of the Bible that's been polished by centuries of Western tradition. He wants the raw, unfiltered, and frankly terrifying director's cut. In the Ethiopian canon, the resurrection isn't just a quiet exit from a tomb. It's a high-stakes, multidimensional war. Gibson has hinted in interviews that the sequel will delve into the harrowing of hell, a journey into the abyss where Jesus confronts the principalities of darkness. This isn't just theology for Mel, it's a cosmic action thriller. The Ethiopian Bible provides the perfect storyboard for this vision. While the Western New Testament stays relatively grounded on earth after the stone rolls away, the Ethiopian texts, drawing from the Book of Enoch and the Epistula Apostolorum, describe a reality where the veil between worlds is paper-thin. Gibson, a man who has famously struggled with his own demons and public redemption, seems fascinated by the idea of a warrior Jesus who descends into the lowest depths to kick down the doors of death itself. To tell that story, you need more than the 4 standard Gospels. You need the Forbidden Files. Think about Gibson's filmography: Braveheart, Apocalypto, Hacksaw Ridge. He is a filmmaker of the visceral. He wants to show the blood, the dirt, and the spiritual physics of the miracle. The Ethiopian tradition offers exactly that, a version of the faith that hasn't been civilized by the Enlightenment or European sensibilities. It's ancient, it's mystical, and it's unapologetically supernatural. For a director who wants to shock the world back into a sense of awe, these texts are a goldmine of imagery that Western audiences have literally never seen on screen. Furthermore, there is the rebel connection. Gibson has often found himself at odds with the Hollywood establishment, much like the Ethiopian church found itself isolated from the Roman and Byzantine centers of power. There is a shared DNA of holding the line against a world that wants to edit your story. By tapping into the Ethiopian canon, Gibson isn't just making a movie. He's performing an act of cinematic archaeology. He's telling the world, you think you know this story, but you've only seen the trailer. The buzz surrounding his research into these texts has sent shockwaves through the industry. If he actually depicts the scenes found in the Kebra Nagast or the detailed post-resurrection dialogues of the Ethiopian scrolls, he won't just be making a sequel, he'll be introducing the world to a lost Bible that most people didn't even know existed. For Gibson, the Ethiopian Bible isn't an extra book. It's the missing piece of the puzzle that makes the whole picture make sense. He's betting that audiences are tired of the predictable and are ready for the profound, the weird, and the ancient. What did Jesus actually say when the stone rolled away? Portals, Enoch, and the multiverse of the Ethiopian canon. If you think the multiverse is a concept invented by Marvel screenwriters, you haven't read the Ethiopian Bible. While Western theology often presents a very linear, three-story house model of reality, heaven above, hell below, and us in the middle, the Ethiopian canon describes a cosmos that is terrifyingly complex, layered, and teeming with life that isn't human. At the heart of this hidden dimension narrative is the Book of Enoch, a text so explosive that the Western Church effectively banned it for over 1,000 years. Yet, the Ethiopian Church kept it front and center as a pillar of their faith. The Book of Enoch isn't just a religious text. It reads like a field manual for a higher dimension.
Early Jews and Christians were rarely satisfied with such vague biblical passages, which leads us to its spin-off, the Book of Enoch. This text was so popular for early Christians that even the New Testament cites it.
It tells the story of the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth, broke their celestial vows, and genetically tampered with humanity to create the Nephilim, giants of old. But more importantly for our post-resurrection mystery, it describes Enoch being taken on a guided tour of the chariots of heaven and the portals of the winds. It speaks of places where time doesn't exist and where the physical laws of our world simply dissolve. When you view the resurrection through the lens of the Ethiopian Enoch, the event ceases to be a medical miracle and becomes a dimensional shift. The Ethiopian tradition suggests that when Jesus rose, he wasn't just coming back to life in a biological sense. He was opening a permanent gateway between these hidden dimensions and our own. The 40 days he spent with the disciples weren't just for comfort, they were for calibration. He was teaching them how to perceive a reality that included these higher folds of existence. In the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, we see hints of this multidimensional travel even further back in history. It describes the Ark of the Covenant not as a mere gold box, but as a Zion that could move with supernatural speed, almost as if it were folding space-time. The text describes the Ark flying through the air like a cloud, guided by a power that defied gravity. When Jesus returns after the resurrection, the Ethiopian manuscripts suggest he is operating with that same Zion energy. He enters locked rooms not by picking the lock, but by stepping through the fabric of the room itself. This hidden dimension aspect is what makes the Ethiopian Bible so dangerous to traditional Western structures. If the physical world is just one layer of a much larger, interactive multiverse, then the rules of the world, the power of governments, the finality of death, the scarcity of resources start to look like illusions. The Ethiopian texts suggest that Jesus gave his followers the keys to navigate these dimensions. This wasn't just spiritual metaphor. It was a description of a new type of human existence. The manuscripts describe Jesus speaking of 7 heavens and the various stations of the soul. He details the guardians of these gates and the passwords of faith required to move through them. To a modern ear, this sounds like science fiction, but to the Ethiopian monks who have chanted these verses for 18 centuries, it is the highest form of science. They believe that the Western Bible is like a map of a single city, while the Ethiopian Bible is a map of the entire galaxy. Why is this relevant to the "this was never meant to be found" narrative? Because a multidimensional Jesus is much harder to control than a purely moral teacher Jesus. If the resurrection proved that the physical world is subordinate to a vast, unseen infrastructure, then the people who hold the blueprints to that infrastructure have immense power. By keeping the Book of Enoch and the Jubilees in their canon, the Ethiopian Church preserved a version of Christianity that is deeply quantum. Imagine the scene. The disciples are gathered in the upper room and Jesus appears. In the Western version, they eat some fish. In the Ethiopian inflected tradition, he begins to explain the chariots of glory and how the Watchers are still influencing the shadows of the world. He warns them that the war isn't against flesh and blood, but against principalities that exist in those very dimensions Enoch visited. He is giving them a soldier's briefing for a war that spans across time and space. This is the hidden dimension that Gibson is reportedly so keen to capture. He doesn't want to film a man walking through a door. He wants to film a man stepping through the concept of a door. The Ethiopian Bible provides the visual vocabulary for that kind of storytelling. It describes angels not as men with wings, but as wheels within wheels, and beings of burning fire and countless eyes. It describes the afterlife not as a fluffy cloud, but as a series of treasuries where the very elements of the universe are stored. By sidelining these books, the Western world lost the weirdness of the gospel. We traded the multiverse for a moral code. But as we move into an era of quantum physics and string theory, the ancient Ethiopian descriptions of folded heavens and multiple dwellings are starting to look less like myths and more like early observations of a complex reality. The Ethiopian Bible didn't just preserve the past, it might have been holding on to our future. The hidden dimensions of the Ethiopian canon remind us that the story of Jesus doesn't end with a goodbye. It ends with an open door. And according to these ancient texts, once that door is open, no power on earth or in any other dimension can truly shut it again. The Vatican knows about these books, so why aren't they in your pew? Knowledge as Power and the Politics of Apocrypha. If the Ethiopian Bible contains such high-octane, cinematic, and revolutionary information, the question naturally follows: why isn't this the global standard? Why did the Western Church, the powerhouse of Rome, and later the Protestant reformers, decide that 66 books were just right, while the Ethiopian 81 were too much? The answer isn't just a matter of theological preference, it's a matter of power, control, and the systemic suppression of anything that made the common man a little too spiritually independent. Let's look at the suppression and at the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD and the later North African councils. These weren't just prayer meetings, they were administrative boardrooms. The early church was transitioning from a persecuted underground movement to a state-sponsored religion of the Roman Empire. To run an empire, you need order. You need a clear, centralized hierarchy. You need a user manual that is easy to follow, and more importantly, easy to police. The books found in the Ethiopian canon, like the Book of Enoch or the Ascension of Isaiah, were what the authorities called volatile.
The Book of Enoch is kind of a misnomer. First Enoch is a compilation of several texts stitched together. There are obvious and abrupt seams between sections that are best explained by the theory that someone brought them all together into a compilation sometime in the past.
They were texts that spoke of direct revelation, multi-dimensional travel, and a cosmic war that bypassed the local priest or the regional bishop. If every believer thought they could access the 7 heavens or had the blueprints to the angelic hierarchies, the centralized authority of Rome would crumble. The Great Edit was essentially a corporate merger, where the most radical departments were shut down to ensure a consistent brand. By labeling these books as Apocrypha, meaning hidden or obscure, the Western Church didn't necessarily say they were false. They just said they were dangerous for the uneducated public. They were moved to the restricted section of the spiritual library. Over centuries, restricted became forgotten, and forgotten became heretical. The Ethiopian Church, however, was geographically and politically insulated by the rugged mountains of East Africa and the rise of Islamic caliphates that cut them off from Rome. They missed the memo that they were supposed to burn the weird stuff. This creates a massive suppression theory that resonates today, especially in the era of deep state narratives and corporate whistleblowers. The idea is that the most potent parts of Jesus' message, the parts dealing with the nature of reality, the fallen watchers, and the resurrection extension, were intentionally scrubbed to keep the population in a state of simple faith. Simple faith is easier to tax. Simple faith is easier to conscript into crusades. A population that understands the quantum nature of the gospel is much harder to manipulate. Even today, when scholars bring up the Ethiopian Garima Gospels or the Book of Jubilees, there is often a patronizing dismissal from Western academies. They call it local tradition or Eastern fringe. But as Mel Gibson's research reportedly suggests, the fringe is where the original fire is often found. The suppression wasn't just about what Jesus did, it was about what Jesus authorized humanity to become. The Ethiopian texts suggest a level of human potential and spiritual authority that makes the traditional sheep and shepherd metaphor look like a massive downgrade. The Vatican's secret archives are often the subject of Dan Brown-style thrillers, but the real secret isn't a hidden bloodline or a golden chalice. The real secret is the editing process itself. The fact that for 1,500 years, the West has been reading a condensed version of the greatest story ever told. When you look at the Ethiopian Bible, you aren't looking at extra content. You're looking at the original scope of the faith before it was tailored to fit the needs of European monarchs and Roman popes. This is why the discovery and wider translation of these texts feel so forbidden. They represent a lost frequency of Christianity, one that is more mystical, more cosmic, and far more cinematic than the version most of us grew up with. The suppression wasn't a one-time event. It was a slow fade. But thanks to the digital age and the curiosity of creators like Gibson, the black box of the Ethiopian highlands is being opened. The information is leaking out, and the powers that be can no longer keep the lid on the 81-book reality. The politics of Apocrypha tells us that knowledge is the ultimate currency. If you can control the story of the resurrection, you can control the world's perception of life and death. By holding on to these books, the Ethiopian monks didn't just preserve paper, they preserved a spiritual insurgency that is only now, 2,000 years later, reaching the global stage. Is it possible the most important part of the story was the ending we never saw? Faith, folklore, and the search for the ultimate truth. We are standing at a crossroads where ancient ink meets modern high definition. The Ethiopian Bible isn't just a historical relic, it's a challenge to the standard version of reality we've accepted for centuries. Whether it's the visceral, supernatural cinema of Mel Gibson or the quiet, tireless preservation by monks in the Tigray highlands, the message is clear. The story of Jesus didn't end with a whisper. It began with a cosmic roar that the Western world tried to muffle. The 81-book reality suggests that we live in a universe far more complex, more dangerous, and more brilliant than our curated traditions let on. By exploring the resurrection extension and the hidden dimensions of the Book of Enoch, we aren't just looking for new information, we are reclaiming a lost heritage. If these texts were never meant to be found, it's only because they possess the power to shift our perspective from being passive observers of a faith to active explorers of a multidimensional kingdom. The stone has been rolled away, the black box is open, and the full story is finally coming to light. The truth is no longer hidden in the highlands, and if you're ready to decode more forbidden history, hit that subscribe button. The stone has rolled. Don't get left in the dark.